Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Amalfi, canonically the oldest of the Italian maritime republics. We covered on multiple occasions Venice, Genoa, Pisa already, and we will have to talk about the minor ones, right, because you can't really tell which one was the first and what exactly, qualifies in early high medieval times, the title of maritime republic in general. I already made videos that explain this, generally speaking, how these policies had come about specifically, and hopefully today I will explain more to the point the case of the Amalfitans as such. Right? This center is particular. It was actually the smallest of also at least what would have become the major urban development of the Italian peninsula, the maritime republics. But it's also a relatively recent center in the first place. Differently from Genoa and Pisa, that were already important ports in Roman times, Amalfi is just like Venice, and that's in fact the parallelism there. Both these centers evolved from essentially medieval settlements, from settlements that surely existed also in ancient times, but that were not particularly documented. And of course, the most important thing being the political foundation, right? The sense of community and how they began to take the sea with an incredibly aggressive and entrepreneurial bias. The Chronica Amalfitana, that was followed eventually by other authors, gave birth to Amalfi from essentially a Roman colony that, however, had been shipwrecked on her way to Constantinople during the 4th century, which sounds relatively bizarre, right? This colony would have thus been established, not even in Amalfi, that is the coastal center, we see the pictures also here, but Scala, essentially a fraction, a town, another settlement on the mountains. We will see that, like other maritime republics, normally there is a very strong, let's say, factor played by the ground, right? By the fact, in this case, that the republic was sheltered by massive mountains in the hinterland, right? That made it very difficult, as we will see also in Norman times, to seize this center from land, in the absence especially of a fleet that at that point would come in the west of the Pisans, as a matter of fact, to terminate most of the Amalfitan power. But this, let's say, this setting is interesting because it may hint at the, let's say, kind of late antique or migration era context, naturally the necessity of some more inland centers to have developed, to be more sheltered from raids, piracies that were going on, as you know, quite frequently at the time. In reality, ancient sources are silent about Amalfi until the 8th century. However, it must be admitted that the city district was occupied by villas, farms, perhaps even some small villages since the time of the Roman Empire, right? Definitely these were inhabited areas. The location was quite formidable in itself, so there hadn't been any known power, let's say, it could compare, especially in times where there were much greater centers like Rome taking over much larger swaths of territory than the imperial power, the medieval powers. In any case, we find marble, clay fragments as archaeological evidence, right, scattered around the center. In the 8th century, specifically between 783 and 785, Amalfi, and that's as late as we arrive to know about the city, was because it was besieged on this occasion by the powerful Prince of Benevent, the Lombard Arichis. And so at this point, the story. I made a video about the so-called Langobardian Minor, mostly represented by this powerful, in fact, Duchy of Benevent, that mostly controlled the continental southern Italian mainland, and that was trying, in fact, to seize what were technically still, just like, I mean, we're talking about Amalfi, but the same goes for Naples, we'll see it now, Gaeta, etc. Some essentially autonomous Byzantine duchies, right, that had already taken on kind of the profile of maritime powers that were increasingly essentially detached from Constantinople. It were self-administering, being connected with this broader Byzantine coastal maritime dimension, trade contacts, and, as we'll see now, military coordination. In fact, on the occasion of Arica's siege, Amalfi was freed by Neapolitan forces, right? As we will see later with a bit of the geography of the area, the Bay of Naples is immediately north of the peninsula, in the south of which Amalfi lays, right? It's the Amalfi Coast. It's one of the most famous touristic destinations in the world. Well, there's a massive history, as we will see, behind not just Amalfi and these other towns, and there is specific territory that helped playing, as we've seen, the autonomy of these republics. Technically, Amalfi was part of the Duchy of Naples at the time, which means that, again, it was a center of relatively recent growth, right? Naples was historically a larger city. It was part of it's a more open ground with connections with the hinterland, so it's not uniquely maritime, right? But it had that dimension as well, and could fundamentally help these autonomous coastal centers from defending them from the Lombard attacks that were to come to threaten the Neapolitans as well, right? So at this point, these communities are still in contact with Constantinople. It's normal, really. I mean, multiple videos about Byzantine Italy, and I explained there a bit better how the whole thing works. So if you're interested, you can check those out in the Byzantine history playlist. I think there is a Byzantine Italy playlist as well. In 812, for example, we are in Charlemagne's time, Amalfi and Naples supplied ships to the Byzantine Admiralty, interestingly enough. So we notice already that kind of naval, not just maritime bias, right? We're talking about advanced naval cultures with a substantial also manpower and capacity of, say, strategic projection, not just trade ones. And this will be even more evident during the Saracen period, we'll see now. Now, thanks to the activity of the Amalfitans, who dedicated themselves, and due to the aforementioned narrowness of the territory, just the city laying on the sea with the shoulders well covered by the mountains, the city was involved in traffic, and it soon became the master of trade, essentially along the Neapolitan and Roman coasts in the north, right? Amalfi grew thus so rapidly in wealth and power that it could become even independent from the Dukes of Naples. Remember, the duchy terminology here stands for probably a military government. There was a bit of Lombard influence because technically there are comital rules, as we will see, within even the ducal profile of the Byzantine district. But the idea that, again, these communities were actively involved in naval military operations is one of the single most important aspects of their fortune and, in fact, of their power. The evidence here is how Amalfi freed herself from Naples, practically. In fact, at some point, the Lombards succeeded in capturing Amalfi, but the problem was maintaining it. The inhabitants could take refuge in these other impervious nests just on these cliffs above the sea and strike back. Sigurd of Benevent conquered and sacked the city, the inhabitants in large numbers were also deported to Salerno, by the way, that is in the south. It was an important, one of the few proper Lombard centers on the sea, because the Lombards were mostly a continental power. They didn't have much of a navy, or at least not as much as this Byzantine duchies. And Sigurd thought that Amalfi was done for, right? We are in 836. However, only 3 years later, when Sigurd died, the Amalfitans rebelled against the Lombards, and they managed to strike the same Salerno, burning part of that, and making themselves independent, right? Electing a certain Peter as head with the title of Comes, by the way. So this reflects just the amount of moral and material resources that the Amalfitans had, even after having suffered a Lombard sack, right, in getting their act back together and striking the very enemies that had struck them, and essentially autonomizing themselves and giving this community a more hierarchical profile, right? The Amalfitan duchy at that time, as it remained until the 11th century, began to compose an important territorial dominion inland as well, as it embraced almost the entire northern coast of the Gulf of Salerno, between the territory of Sorrento to the west and the same principality of Salerno to the east. The Campanian coastline goes essentially from northwest to southeast. This space, as we said, is basically squeezed between the sea and the top of this rugged chain known as the Lactarian Mountains. And beyond the mountains, the Amalfitans did expand, especially on the northern side, to include other towns such as Lettere and Gragnano, and reaching part of the Stabian territory as far as Sarno, that is to say, basically from, in fact, the Neapolitan side of the watershed, right? So at the boundaries with the Duchy of Naples. And that's how impervious those areas really were, right? Trying to besiege Amalfi from the hinterland was really a massive logistical enterprise. Also, the most famous, touristically, island of Capri belonged to the Amalfitans at this point. These were all bases that could be used by the Amalfitan navy. The cities and lands that were part of this system, besides Amalfi and Atrani, that was an old important town. So if you look on the coast towards the west, were Praiano, Vectica, Maier, and Positano. On the mountains above, you find the towns of Scala, the aforementioned one, for which, in theory, this, at least some of the earliest settlements to make up Amalfi would have eventually developed, Ravello, and Tramonti on the eastern side, Minori, Maiori, and Cetara. The latter place being actually quite famous because it's a place where they still make the closest thing existing to the ancient Roman garum. It's a sort of fish sauce that is treated particularly and used as seasoning. Now, from that moment, and for a long time, with the affirmation properly of the comital order that would evolve also towards something more unitary, Amalfi, whose navy had acquired an importance equal to that of the Neapolitan one by this point, remained in the foreground in the struggles that took place along the coasts of the southern Italian mainland, naturally aiming to ensure autonomy and power in between. Right, they could easily shelter themselves. The other territories, such as the Neapolitan ones, were again more open they had a larger hinterland, were more complicated to defend in a way. So the Amalfitans would profit from their shelter position that would become as a sort of, again, a place of investment fundamentally, because again, these guys have a fleet on their own. So you should first of all crush their fleet, and then having still another fleet capable of besieging the city, and that can have also some mainland contact. So it's a very complicated thing, and this is just like, think about Venice, in part the same Genoa, right? Venice not with the mountains, but with the lagoon. So the advantage that these powers had over practically any other at sea, because fleets were normally assembled ad hoc, even by the largest powers, and were not just a permanent, say, instrument of threat, especially against these more fortified and well strategically located nests that were more useful as allies rather than anything, right? So it was easier, paradoxically, for these more compact powers to exploit the general disorder was following, right? Because this is the age of the Saracen piracy that I discussed here and there, different videos about this people that have been depicted basically as sort of, the scourge of the sea and all this kind of stuff. But if you actually look at what happened exactly during the 9th and 10th century, in the build-up of those same Italian maritime forces, such as also Pisa and Genoa, it would sweep in the 11th century the Mediterranean from Saracen presence. You realize that these centers were on the coast were far from being scared, terrorized, kind of impaired or anything, but were building up essentially the most advanced medieval naval engineering, culture, and beyond, right, properly from a military point of view, and gathering an insane amount of wealth in the process. In fact, the Amalfitan example is quite illustrative. Amalfi's policy towards the Saracens varied in relation to the various moments. At first, open hostility. This would remain the main outlook, so much so that if you go to the Vatican and you visit Raffaello's rooms, there is a beautiful painting depicting the Battle of Ostia, we will see now in 849, with a writing in Latin that says, Contra hostes fidei semper pugnavit Amalfi. And now we will see it's not entirely true, but it sounds like Amalfi really literally always fought against the enemies of faith. Because that's what really happened. Just like with the Vikings, the Magyars, we think that these second invaders, as they're called, just came out of the blue and made a mess without basically the others doing anything about that. The actual political and strategic balance is that these peoples were able to do what they did exclusively because the peoples from post-Carolingian Europe allowed them or called them to actively carry that out, right? To wear out, in times of internal political crisis, a further pressure on especially the main centers from which they wanted to autonomize themselves. And this is particularly the case. In any case, again, nobody liked these Moors around. Amalfi took part in the expedition aimed against the Saracens, both in the one which conducted in union with Naples, Gaeta Sorrento, leading to the victory at Cape Licosa in 846, but also the one to which Pope Leo IV adhered, right, especially after the Saracen sack of the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul in Rome, and which, in fact, concluded itself with the famous naval victory at Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber in 849, in which the Saracen fleet was crushed, right? And what is fascinating about this, we'll see it again with the Battle of the Garigliano in 915, etc., is the incredible effort was put together by in this case, the Italian mainland, not only, right, there were also other players. We're talking mostly about the Italic kingdom, there were the Byzantines involved. They were actually all competing with one another, but at some point, when the Saracen excess was going really too far, they simply coalesced and managed to crush with their forces these invaders that evidently weren't the strongest. And even later, Amalfi persisted, of course, in her anti-Saracenic attitude in accordance with the policy of the Frankish emperors and popes. I'll digress briefly on, say, the relation that Amalfi had with the mainland. It was really limited, actually. Much less, basically, than any other power in the southern Italian mainland. But that still looked at this kind of decentralized position from both empires, right? Doesn't matter that they basically fell within the Byzantine one still in theory. They were becoming de facto independent by a degree. They would, of course, search for a stabilizing force. The reason why the Carolingian Empire collapsed was not really these guys' fault specifically, would have avoided that. In any case, they wanted to be decentralized, wanted to stay within this limbo between essentially a Constantinopolitan force that was interior out there, especially from the sea, but again at the very limit of the same, so they would actually operate on her behalf, and not having any major, we'll see what happened, power in mainland, for example, in Ottonian times, to really harass them, to essentially surround them both from the sea and the mainland, so to choke them to subjection, which would happen to Amalfi only with the Normans, and after repeated efforts, right? Because it was, again, a very complicated place to access in the first place, and that also could be simply co-opted in other ways with other roles. Recognized in 866 the sovereignty of the Frankish emperor, Italic monarch Louis II, ruling from Pavia, Amalfi, which had him even as a guest, right, helped him in 872 with her fleet to free the Bishop of Naples, Athanasius, a prisoner on the island of the Savior, having in exchange the island of Capri given by the emperor as a reward, importantly enough. So you understand that this is a context in which, of course, the emperor was trying to consolidate further power in the southern Italian mainland, especially this one particularly close to Rome in Campania, that could provide with a substantial territorial continuity of the Italic realm, by again using a power that was to remain decentralized anyway. Right, the Amalfitans knew that, because even if at this point they had just asked for something in favor, right, and so accumulating the further territories that were coming under their control. Amalfi still supplied Pope John VIII in 870-72 with her ships, but then, following the example of the Neapolitans, she withdrew from the struggle in 875. Amalfi even led a band of Muslims to occupy one of her marinas, the aforementioned Cetara, in 879. The reason being at this point an hostility with the Byzantine navy, right, that was essentially active in the area, say, frightening the same Islamic pirates, among whom there were actually plenty of Christians, by the way, from Spain, from the same Italy. So again, it's not just the Moor, right, in these kind of things. But generally speaking, understanding that the Saracens were at least not the main threat, especially to her at that point. In fact, the Byzantines had managed to crush the Saracen fleet, right, that was capable of bringing together. We were talking about the Saracens vaguely, but here we should make all the history, let's say, of the invasion of Sicily that they did actually. The consolidation under the Aghlabid power, later the Fatimids. So we're not talking about just a bunch of pirates, right? There are some, they are technically, but they're sponsored by more powerful polities, right, with a substantial territorial capacity, including the control of Sicily, most of Sicily at this point. And of course, with Constantinople wanting to effectively restore Byzantine sovereignty, that at that point had been shaken, also on the Italian mainland, because as we've seen, Louis II had been intervening in Campania. There had been a competition between the two empires for dislodging certain Saracen nests, namely in Bari and in Taranto. The former had been freed by the Carolingians, which Bari was de facto a Greek Byzantine city, and this was showing off prepotently in the south to prove that Constantinople was not able to defend her own subjects overseas and such things. Very complex context. In any case, Amalfi not only held for the Carolingians together with Naples, but even with Naples, it was even decided, despite the efforts of John VIII, to form, at least at sea, an alliance with the Saracens, right? Necessary for the two cities at that point to obtain what was objectively freedom of trade, and so an increase in their power, actually. So you understand how even the maritime and the continental dimension are two different things, especially for someone that is basically straddling the two. As the price of the alliance, Amalfi had to allow the Saracens to plunder the lands of the Lombard princes that were, generally speaking, always this looming threat from the most immediate mainland at a very close distance, right? If it hadn't been for the mountains, right, those coastal areas would have been taken over like others. And even the papal territory. We are in 881, right? The Carolingian Empire is falling apart. This is the moment at which the second invasions really are hitting the hardest. Only later, where in fact the conditions had changed, right, had been tilting towards the other extreme, Amalfi returned to fight against the Saracens, supporting the Lombard prince of Capua, Atenulf I. And initially victorious at the mouth of the Garigliano River in 903, the Saracens were forced to abandon the very fortress they had established there, terrorizing mostly the Roman hinterland. With the famous battle of 915, that was again a more impressive victory than the one of Austin. Basically, dislodged the Saracens for good from central Italy, and is in fact remembered as one of these enormous international efforts in which the navies of these very, at this point, autonomous, if not de facto independent Byzantine duchies have been really, really important. So this juggling between the Lombards and the Saracens, between the Frankish and the Byzantine emperors, had allowed Amalfi in such turbid times to preserve her own autonomy. These centers, after the destruction of most Byzantine continental possessions in Italy, had been dependent politically, administratively, on the Sicilian patrician, right, properly Byzantine Sicily, that, however, as we know, was now being eroded by the Muslims. And the Emperor Constantine VII, writing his De Administrando Imperio, points out the fact that those Campanian maritime duchies were de facto independent, right? It was just a purely nominal connection that, of course, they would maintain, because again they had nothing to lose from that, right? They could claim themselves, we are the actual part of the the empire, right? We've always been so. We're just essentially acting on behalf of the same Constantinople, while of course not really giving a damn, right? And actually being able at some point even to ask for some help or delegation, legitimization, and so on. Nor did the Lombard princes succeed in suffocating the Amalfitan freedom. Indeed, on the occasion of the attempt by Landulf II, Duke of Benevent, to reunite all the southern Longobards in a single state, and it went close to that in the south, Massals I, Judge of Amalfi, so the official, the governor, the de facto ruler of the city, allied with the Longobard Gisuf of Salerno. That was one of because the Beneventans at this point had witnessed they had been elevated actually to princes at that point. After the fall of the Longobard kingdom, they had decided to step up formally. But while previously the Beneventan state had been fundamentally one piece, now Salerno and Capua had been parting ways, or at least they had tried to acquire their own autonomy within the system, right? So at this point, the Amalfitans exploited such internal fragmentation, and together, in fact, with the Salernitans, occupied the Cava Valley, right, in the hinterland, essentially foiling Landulf's design in 946. In the meantime, the internal constitution of Amalfi was changing towards a more hierarchical profile, right? First, Amalfi had been organized in a sort of republican fashion under the regime of some comites that would act collegially, right? This lasted especially between 839 and 859. The concept being, again, that there would be different clans, right? Families that would at some point appoint a higher leader in the form of the duke, plus other officials, magistrates, etc. This comites had taken on properly the profile of an annual magistracy, right? Then, more and more, Amalfi was reduced to a princely dynastic power that conferred essentially more greater political unity to the government, right? That was needed, generally speaking, given the constant gamble that just a naval policy in that mess of the mid-10th century really entailed. Also with now newly, with new aggressive Christian powers rising together with her, with whom they had to compete. There was also the age of the prefects that last, because these were different magistracies at some point, even existing in parallel. But let's say the prefects lasted between 859 and 958. And they succeeded the comital institution, and they embodied more the aforementioned kind of monarchic, or at least single, ruler form of some sort in the city. Already in 872, there had been the first attempt to create properly a dynasty, right? A local clan would be recognized as the most powerful. And this had been mirrored by the prefecture of Marinus, who associated to his rule his son Pulchers. A new dynasty king with Manso I was associated instead his own son Massals I. We are in the year 900 this time. Both became, by the way, imperial patricians. In other words, Constantinople recognized these titles, right, proving the fact again that the connection with the empire was always there, and that for the Byzantine emperors was particularly important to keep kind of a minimal, connection with these polities, or recognizing them as at least their subjects by a degree to, also make leverage for something else in exchange. So a nominal Byzantine sovereignty, but also a dramatic amount of autonomy locally. Because, as we've seen often just in the Byzantine history videos, there was hardly much of a chance to operate there, right? The main areas that the Byzantines would like to recover were Apulia, Calabria, even Sicily at some point, right? So they were interested in what were arguably also just from a broader political and strategical and territorial interest, some other ports, some greater chunks of mainland, right? The Campanian maritime duchies were instead like this string from properly the other side of the Italian peninsula, complex to reach, very, in fact, navally strong, right? So very difficult to even reach, like logistically. How could you threaten them, right, without triggering a massive reaction that would have endangered whichever forces you would have sent up to there, right, within an incredibly stretched line of communication from the main bases, whichever they were, plus in a time in which the Arabs still controlled Sicily. They could intervene themselves to wear out your own supply lines, to just make you fail, and maybe you're regaining some further foothold in the southern Italian mainland, which is what instead the Byzantines were, at least from that side, where there weren't maritime republics or anything, and but things were mostly in the hands of the Arabs that worked essentially in a different way. They were trying to recover, also successfully. But speaking of that dynastic profile, we have then Sergius I, who ousted Marcellus II and had himself created Duke of Amalfi in 958, right? And this dukedom would remain as properly the top of the hierarchical unitary regime, ruling institutions. The development of the Amalfitan trade at this point corresponded to the development of foreign policy as well as the internal one of the city, right? Amalfi extended since the 9th century her connections to the Papal State, Sicily, Taranto, right? And during the 10th century, the Amalfitan merchants had been reaching all the main ports of the Eastern Mediterranean consistently. So with this, there was an increase, constant increasing wealth and in power for the city. The Amalfitans could protect their own vessels. They could therefore act as a sort of wedge within, again, much more unstable systems. Were some of the earliest Italians to start what would have become, the great age of the maritime republics. According to the merchant of Baghdad, Ibn Avkal, who visited Amalfi in 972. Remember, this is the peak of the Islamic Golden Age, right? Where at the time, these years of the rule of the Duke Sergius that we just mentioned. Well, Ibn Akbal states that Amalfi had become more important than Naples, right? And that she was the, quote, the most prosperous city of Lombardia, the most noble, the most illustrious for her conditions, the most comfortable and opulent, right? And he was right about that. In terms of per capita wealth, this was accomplished. It's interesting, of course, how the Arabs consider the entire Italy, Lombardia, aside from any kind of Byzantine or Germanic rule, right, distinguished, right, which obviously speaks volumes about what Italy actually was in a much more culturally unitary system that it's usually been stereotyped. Now, as a result of this increasing wealth, even a bishopric in Amalfi was established in 987, right? And yet the dangers from which such independence of the city could be threatened had not ceased. In other words, the Amalfitans had wanted their own liberty. Now they had to cope with the threats also more liberally, right, without protection. Some of this was actually a more complicated issue. For example, the Saxon emperor's expeditions in southern Italy. I made multiple videos about this phase, at least in the relations between the Ottonians and the Byzantines. Will hopefully make some other content about properly Ottonian warfare more in detail soon. However, the Ottonian threat, even though it was bigger, right, as you know, failed on the longer run. Especially the Saracens were able to crush the German army at Cotrone in 982. Otto II barely escaped with his life, almost being kidnapped by the Byzantines, were just literally fished him up, right, or at least, took him hostage from the coast during the escape, and he threw himself off boat, reaching the Calabrian coast, because he realized would have been just deported and imprisoned in Constantinople, even though he was married to a Byzantine princess. Because, how do you want, like, from a Byzantine point of view, to let yourself escaping the possibility of imprisoning your main competitor, let's say, out there. More threatening for Amalfi were, however, the smaller but more, direct attacks of the neighboring Lombard princes of Salerno, as we've seen just in the south. Also considering how more distant the Byzantine Empire actually was becoming. So again, that umbrella of protection was fundamentally vanishing from Constantinople. Italy was taking kind of a different profile, consolidation of local powers, and recomposition under other logic, let's put it this way. This explains, by the way, how at the time of the descent of Otto I in 967, Mansell, Duke and Patrician of Amalfi, remained formally loyal to the Byzantine Empire, right? And on the other hand, how the Duke himself plotted with Marinus II of Naples against Gisulf, Prince of Salerno, managing even to make him prisoner in 973. However, this last struggle in particular would have had an unfortunate sequel for the Duke of Amalfi, who, after having managed to win Gisulf and his ally Pandulf of Capua again, taking possession of the Principality of Salerno in 981, was defeated and driven out in turn from occupied territory in 983, right? While exactly the Ottonians had been crushed from the area. Now, sometime later, the pressure of the princes of Salerno was felt in Amalfi even more strongly. In 1039, Weimar V of Salerno, aided by the Normans of Aversa, we'll talk about them in a while, conquered the Duchy of Amalfi, right? And although he restored power to the Duke Manso II, the blind man who had been deprived of it by his own brother John, actually established the Salernitan dominion over Amalfi. Right, the city had proven at that point that a recompaction of even a relatively secondary mainland power, compared with the major international players, could endanger the independence of the city. And that Amalfi was being cornered as much as, the mountain ridges could defend her, at the same time could also bottle her, and the seas were getting ever more crowded. Again, the Pisans, the Genoans are expanding, firing wide, they're crushing the Saracens. the Amalfitans actually participate even to their expedition on the Balearic Islands, on the Iberian coast, right? These Italian fleets were essentially the maritime power of the Reconquista. In any case, the aforementioned Salernitan dominion was shattered in 1052 by the Amalfitans, who expelled Manso and recalled John, who had, by the way, in the meanwhile, taken refuge in Constantinople. So again, the Byzantine card was always there. Again, the possibility of the empire coming back in southern Italy lasted consistently until the 12th century, right? But for Amalfi, independence was now about to wane anyway, because reduced to actually pretty bad conditions by the princes of Salerno, as we've seen. The Amalfitans didn't have any other capacity to safeguard their own independence and turned to a greater, or at least, fresher, more powerful ruler, Robert Guiscard, in 1073. As a consequence, Salerno was blocked by land by the Normans and by sea by the Amalfitans. Right? However, the latter had to let their city occupied by the Normans, getting peace at de facto the cost of independence. The Normans, as you know, had been starting in the area as bodyguards for the pilgrims directed to the Holy Land, and had been gradually essentially hired as mercenaries by the Lombards, and had begun to start carving some possessions on their own through the fiefs they received from their employers, and calling other people from France. Norman, by this point, is a synecdoche for lots of different peoples, who were Normans from Normandy, Bretons, Flemish, people from other places of Gaul, of Italy, Germany, and further places. In any case, they were, as you know, pretty crafty adventurers, and they managed to accomplish, arguably in southern Italy, their greater achievement, right? Over time. So Amalfi was part of this system, right? However, it was not easy for the Normans to keep ruling Amalfi as much as other territories in especially the southern Italian mainland. This is true for since this early age at the time of Robert Guiscard, as much as for later times where the Normans, as you know, established their kingdom, that they centered it at least in Sicily, in Palermo, thus leaving great part, especially the southern Italian mainland, to a decentralized government, and not much of Normans themselves, that occupied mostly the open plains of Apulia, the most fertile ones, but that had great troubles in accessing the Lombard Apennine. And equally at that point, also a center like Amalfi, that rebelled multiple times to the Norman rule. Again, maintaining a permanent garrison was very expensive, or at least it would be done, but not to a degree for which every corner of the Hauteville possession could be just under, the Norman heel, right? So at some point, the Normans would exploit the naval potential of these cities, even though on the longer run their feudalism would crush such urban centers that, especially in this ones would decline significantly, but even the larger cities that were there in southern Italy would not develop their own communal prerogatives like in the center and in the north, right? It would become great agricultural centers run by the barons, holding the estates of the interland, right? So similar mechanisms would bring, as we'll see now, even the same Amalfitan nobility to join that world and to escape literally their homeland, right? The first Amalfitan rebellion against the Siculo-Normans dated back to 1088. when the Amalfitan citizens welcomed the ancient enemy Gisulf of Salerno and appointed him Duke of the same Amalfi, interestingly enough. Definitely they knew each other better between Amalfitans and Longobards than with the Hauteville, with the Normans. And the following year, however, Roger of Hauteville resubjugated Amalfi, which rebels again in 1096, this time creating Duke Marinus Sebastus, that was cooperating at this point with the Duke of Naples. Notice here that the Byzantine titles still, right? These centers had a distinct, say, you see even from the name, a Latin profile, right? Not much of a Greek one, but institutionally speaking, they were still reasoning under the Byzantine Empire, at least this official titles, administrative, system, but in general outlook, right, of the polity. This was naturally an important aspect, even to define their own identity. The Amalfitans were overwhelmed again by the Normans 4 years later in 1100. Then for the third time, at the beginning of the 12th century, Amalfi managed to shake off the Norman yoke, but it was the last time, because Roger II of Hauteville, that had, by the way, become king of Sicily at that point, because, the kingdom came even substantially later, even the same conquest of Sicily, and extended to these other southern Italian mainland territories, subjected Amalfi for good, by force, by the way, in 1131. Roger was a very energetic ruler. He faced major resistance, opposition from all these, again, more decentralized subjects, especially the Longobards, but his energy essentially managed to keep together this territory that, by the way, consider had never been united historically ever since Ostrogothic times. Where in another, say, the times of Justinian, right? Southern Italy had basically disordered itself, in a series of kind of patchy dominions that we've seen deeply intersected between Byzantines and with a substantial difference, as we explained, between Constantinople and power and kind of this local duchies. The Longobards, their own different subdivisions, the Saracens when they stepped in, the Franks, the Ottonians, then the Normans, and more, right? Arguably even as some communities that came from pretty far away, as we will see in a while, especially as far as the mercantile side of the story was concerned. In 1135, called by the Prince of Capua and by those who still resisted the Normans, the Pisan Armada, 46 ships strong, which could have not had a better opportunity to deal mortal blow to her rival. In fact, as we have seen in the videos about medieval Pisa, the Pisans had begun to trade extensively with southern Italy, right? They had received by the Normans a port and a lodge in Naples, right, that close to Amalfi. And they had extended their trade, of course, to Sicily as well as the Levant, starting from these new bases in the south. That's when they had, when and where, by the way, had come into contact with the Amalfitans, who they were the most feared competitors for Pisa at this point, right? Pisa was, taking off and was quite a powerful city already, but the Amalfitans didn't keep either by this point. And they were, of course, would engulf each other in a terrible clash, right? That meant literally Amalfitans and Pisans fighting in the various, cities scattered in the Mediterranean, each one kind of fighting for their own quarter in the center, making a mess in the city. And very often the local authorities really not being able to do anything about that, because even if they could temporarily kick out the Italians, they still needed them for the markets that they were controlling, and these were de facto the only maritime powers around at the time. I mean, I can't stress this enough. It's as if these were essentially the only powers who had de facto permanent fleets at their control, because they could simply, there was not much of a difference, of course, between a war galley and one for more civilian use. And at any time, the same aristocracy who ruled these cities could simply say, okay, we need some ships for a military operation of joint forces, and that was readily available. And these galleys were de facto fighting all the time, were all well armed for the various encounters in the sea with their competitors, with the Saracens, also just because they raided themselves, especially the Islamic territories of North Africa, etc. So what happened in 1135 is that the Pisans literally destroy Amalfi. But this is the actual thing. I mean, not literally, in a physical sense, but the city was horribly sacked, right? Together with, by the way, the other towns that we described before were controlled. So the Pisans disrupted properly the Amalfitan territory in such a terrible and unexpected assault with a major display of force. Again, having more than 40 galleys available for such an operation was a massive force by the early 12th century. Only the castle of Ravello resisted due to his impervious location and mostly, admittedly, the defense of the Amalfitan garrison. Right? The Pisan ships, by the way, came back 2 years later, 1137, with the intention this time to literally destroy, raze to the ground, Amalfi, which, however, managed to ransom herself with gold, interestingly enough. And that was a bit the equivalent of the thing, because, the cities had massive stores of precious metals. The shift of the trade balance from the Islamic world to the Italian maritime republics in Europe in general had dramatically enriched these very cities, because this is the point of that how ferocious that competition is. That anything that crossed the Mediterranean had de facto to pass through the hands of these powers, right? So knocking each other out meant to really cash an overbearing amount of wealth, something basically never seen by scale before, right? Concentrated in a single community. In 1137, not all the settlements under the Amalfitan control could, however, or would want, by the way, to give up so easily. So, for example, Scala and Ravello, that attempted a resistance, were ruthlessly ruined by the Pisans for 3 days of constant devastation. So the whole Duchy of Amalfi became de facto tributary of Pisa by that point. Right, it was within the Kingdom of Sicily, but in terms of maritime accessibility, again, just the Normans were giving the Pisans their own ports, their own quarters, because they were the most profitable, again, and the only power that would have seized those things likely just on their own, with their naval power anyway, right? So in order to make this thing smoothly, they de facto subcontracted much of their possessions, including Amalfi, to the Tuscan Republic. Now, as a consequence, as you understand, Amalfi began her decline, right? So what did the place look like at this point? Because it's important, generally speaking, also to understand how this power had managed to develop internally, right? By the 11th, 12th century, definitely, as you know, there was a generalized demographic, economical revival. So the Amalfitan Duchy was essentially a dense agglomeration of small towns and hamlets occupying the steep and picturesque, to say the least, slopes of the mountains and the valleys behind them. Right in the center of the coast, you have the bigger city, with the hamlets of Poggiola and Tovere that we in part also mentioned before. So a few hundred meters at this point, so almost contiguous, is the very ancient center of Atrani. That is almost swallowed by Amalfi herself, right? And you have beautiful vestiges. Some of the pictures I uploaded here really speak for themselves. There is the Church of the Holy Savior, the Bireto, for example, that constituted the chapel Sacri Palazzi of the Dukes of Amalfi. This is a hell of a mindset. I mean, the idea that the Dukes of Amalfi were considering a church, the one of the Holy Palace, as if it had been the same imperial palace of Constantinople they were ruling from. Right? That's how imperial and Byzantine the Amalfitan institutions really were, right? Especially after they seized power again in that unitary way we described before. Then up in the mountains, you have the settlement of Scala. We mentioned it's about 370 meters above Amalfi. Just consider it, even from a tactical, strategic point of view. We've seen before that this was an avampost that held out against multiple assaults, and was probably one of the oldest, at least, if not the oldest, again, in the region. There were powerful clans, as we mentioned before, the Afflitto, the Sasso, the Frisari, right? These were all, again, the merchant families that had made up the patriciate, that armed the ships, owned the land in hinterland, monopolized the magistracies. They even, they had covered even the ecclesiastical offices since the bishopric of Amalfi had been established, as we've seen in 987. Definitely one of the most beautiful places is the ancient cathedral. The rebuilt later, but still bearing the vestige of the medieval splendor. Scala had 3 hamlets: Campidoglio, Minuto, where the church of the Annunziata is, and Pontone, where the church of Saint Eustache is both monumental but ruined anyway. Again, it's an important historical archaeological vestige. So at 315 meters above the sea level, you have dominating the sea, one of the most beautiful landscapes in the world, Ravello, right? Quite famous, again, naturalistically, for the landscape, for the castle too, we will see now. The center dates to the 9th century, so it basically came up together with, at least in a consistent form, in the moment in which Amalfi was consolidating her power. Ravello became a seat of a bishopric in 1086, by the way. Southern Italy was, like, if you look at the ecclesiastical map of it, it was full of dioceses everywhere. Like in some areas of Central, you had a few scattered or original skeletons, were several tens. And they spoke naturally of the incredible wealth that exactly in such corresponded to the fragmentation of the land, right? Every place was very rich, and there was not really a unitary profile until Norman times, and even a bit beyond. But the local areas were incredibly fertile. If it hadn't been for trade or anything, they were massive, as you know, agricultural exports for most, Apulia especially, but Campania, some surrounding areas. We're not talking about Sicily, of course, and do not underestimate in this sense how much of trade was involved what happened for the first time in history. That is to say, these lands began to export grain for literally the entire like Mediterranean and Europe. Right, in Roman times it was Egypt and Tunisia, and that the empire had to draw the grains from. From medieval times, it's basically Sicily that starts exporting grain every freaking where, even in places like Egypt. Right? And this tells you, it speaks volumes about, again, the changes in political organization. Just it's not just how fertile a land really is, but how you actually run it, which means really, really a lot. Ravenna, by the way, had also her own clans. For example, the Rogadeo, the Ruffolo. There is the magnificent villa we will talk about in a while. We have the pictures here. The Pironti, the Muscettola, the Confalone della Mare, etc., that embellished greatly the place. Then east of Atrani you find other beautiful places such as Minori, the ancient Reginis Minor, from which it takes the name, which was, by the way, one of the arsenals of the Amalfitans, as well as a bishopric as well in 987. So together with Amalfi, by the way. Even further east, you find Maiori, another amazing place. These are all little bays, fundamentally, right? So they are fortified. There are some beaches where you can land, you can unload all the, if one place is blocked, if there are some problems whatsoever, you have different ways to basically get stuff in the interland, right? And they're all connected with paths, with towers. Naturally, you can't see that because most of Europe were literally covered in castles everywhere, smaller ones, but connecting, like we're talking in a single province, you could have several towns, right? Now, we do not see that anymore, but you can understand how organized they were at the time, just to basically render a painful operation for everyone involved to try to get in. Because no geographical barrier is impregnable. So it's really how much you defend it that matters. Maiori takes the name from Reginis Maior, so there were this kind of twin centers with Minori, from where, for a narrow valley, one enters the wide Tramonti Basin to the north. The last Amalfi land to the east, on the borders of the Principality of Salerno. Again, Amalfi is basically between Naples and Salerno, is the aforementioned Cetara, the one of the garum seasoning. Let's say that was apparently a monastic invention. There were monasteries, one in Amalfi is still to be seen. The Capucine friars, we will talk about them in a while. So you have on the western side instead, we've seen Praiano, this Vectica Maior, that rises a short distance above the sea, higher up Vectica Minor, and further up in a wide and redundant valley at Gerola. The last Amalfi to the west, Amalfi land to the west, is really at the borders with the Salernitan Duchy, Positano, which a tradition says was founded by the colonists of Paestum, right after at least the city had been destroyed by the Saracens. Paestum is the south. This thing would have occurred in the 10th century, and the name, however, is the evident corruption of Posidonia, right? That is actually the ancient name of Paestum, so there is surely a connection there. On the northern slope of the Amalfitan Mountains, you have until the 12th century, when they were basically obliterated, these other towns, the one of Lettera and Gragnano. And so further west, you have the basically just the plain with the Stabian territory, right, with some fortifications close to Naples, as a matter of fact, and marking, in fact, the first bulwark against this northern, the Neapolitan Dutch. The trade expansion of Amalfi, as we've seen, had been grandiose, right? Amalfi was the first, again, city to carry out, at least to the extent of political compaction, even before Venice, it was developing that kind of unitary republican policy, right? That surely these centers were advantaged compared to northern Italy, because just the Venetian lagoons were not exactly the best place you would think to develop something so great as Venice would become. So Amalfi was also, as we've seen, actually a recent place emerging. So again, that was mostly what binds her to Venice in comparison to Pisa and Genoa, were some solid cities, in spite of, especially in Genoa, the ups and downs had hurt during the early Middle Ages. And surely this switch that occurred, as you understand here, even from just the history of Amalfi and Pisa, that say in late antiquity, southern Italy was definitely more advanced, more urbanized, more populated, etc., than the north. Not so radically much, but still enough, structurally, systemically, and much better connected. It's not just the geographical position, right, to the Levantine ports and such. Was part of a broader area of culture, right? In antiquity, most of these places, as we've seen, had been Hellenic colonies. They would lose that profile actually over time, but as we've seen, also Greek culture was quite strong in most of the Byzantine coastal centers of southern Italy. So when you look at the Amalfitan expansion during the 10th and 11th century, you realize how marvelous and solid, by the way, the prosperity of this center really were, right? Pisa and Genoa, again, would come later, right? And these were at least Tyrrhenian powers, and Venice would take other ways. There would be always competitions between everybody involved. But aside from the general wealth, what we underestimate is, in fact, is how much the Amalfitans remained active in a broader maritime sense, right? Initially, the Amalfitans were really the dominating maritime force in the Tyrrhenian Sea, the Ionian, by degree the lower Adriatic. Most of this process consisted in colonization. Essentially, the Amalfitan merchants would settle in a quarter of a port city with the permission, fundamentally, of the local authorities, and they would make their business, as we've seen, of course, with a brutal competition with other players, and in part also with the same locals, right? But again, from this privileged, everything went back to the core of the mother city, right? To the idea that if you wanted to go at war with these guys, they had the upper hand at sea, and you couldn't quite dislodge them from where they were. They were not going to go away. The local economy depended on them, their trade hub. So it was not really convenient. It was very often a sort of just extortion, right? But it worked, and that's what most powers really do, if they are actually intelligent to exploit their potential and simply making the others giving way and or finding ways to essentially stemming them. So putting their act together. In the ancient port of Naples, just to give an example also how let's say capillar such infiltration normally was, the Amalfitans had piers for anchoring their ships. They opened exchange desks in the so-called Ruga Campsorum, which was essentially a street, right? They occupied also other places where they carried on an active trade in fabrics. Similarly, all the main cities of southern Italy had true and proper Amalfitan colonies. In Capua, even in the hinterland, where you didn't have to be just Capua had a prosperous river port, but it was still a continental, a country city, right? There was an Amalfitan road in San Germano. The Amalfitan market was held every Saturday, even in such a important and practically Apenninic center like the very Benevent, the capital of the Lombard Principality. There was an Amalfitan colony of extraordinary wealth. The Amalfitans had neighborhoods and streets of their own in the most important ports of the Sicilian kingdom, Palermo, the capital, Messina, and Reggio on the straits. Particularly important became the Apulian colonies, right? Because there was, as we've seen, a lot of agricultural output that needed to be exported, and so by those who had the means. The Amalfitans prospered thus in Bari, Barletta, Trani, Molfetta, Giovinazzo, Monopoli, Brindisi. This is basically the entire Apulian coast. These are some of the most important ports. Traditionally, in Byzantine hands, then passing into the Norman ones. The Amalfitan colonies had obtained various privileges from the first Siculo-Norman kings. It's as if they had been a bit all copies of the motherland, right? The idea of inhabiting one of these quarters was just representing an autonomous community, in part from the same Amalfi, but still unavoidably connected to her because the center again of forces was still there also for the same Amalfitans that had, just the richest that, let's say, businessmen that, as we've seen, owned the land at home, the palaces in the city, the magistracies, so that protected the same colonies out there as they were parceled essentially among them, so that they would all have an obvious interest of sticking together, right? Tancred of Lecce, during his struggles, as you know, during the succession with the Swabians, provided the Amalfitan colonies with the right of essentially electing their own consuls and bailiffs who would administer justice within them. This was important again because these towns were all run by the Sicilian kings. So it wasn't just about them being severed from all the rest. They had to behave in a certain way within the same community, but also being protected in a way like having some sort of immunity, right, as far as they were the Amalfitans. So remember that in the Middle Ages, it was always about a layer of personal worth. Everybody was different, and everybody was more or less important than somebody else. Another important Amalfitan colony arose in Dyrrhachium, in Epirus. So the prosperity achieved, the expertise acquired in navigation, by the way, the natural daring of these people also drove, in fact, the Amalfitans to conquer the large commercial markets of the Levant. Right, since the 10th century, the Amalfitans began to traffic with Tunis, for example, and with other ports of Barbary. Right, at this point, the Saracens had been fundamentally pushed back. There was still some, of course, North African piracy, but the Italians had gained the upper hand by far, and they had their colonies there too, because especially these, the local territorial polities needed equally this kind of suppliers and connection with the broader trade, as it had been before. As we've seen, the same Amalfi had emerged within de facto the broader Islamic trade stretching from the Atlantic to Southeast Asia. You have this beautiful Amalfitan taris with the writing in Arabic to confirm even just the licity, the homogeneity of the thing, but a beautiful Christian cross in the center, right? And this was the case because, of course, the taris were the stronger currency at that point, and because they would mint it on their own. It was technically legal because you needed, hopefully, the consent of in that case, of a caliphal authority, or at least an emiral one or something. But the Christians would mint their own taris because they were the stronger currency in the system, but of course minting it on their own. And so profiting from it, and these powers had emerged literally from the within. And as we've seen, they had not really been brought under by the Saracen piracy either, right? They were consistently already capable of actually crushing them altogether. The Amalfitans then went on to Tripoli in Libya, Alexandria in Egypt, so Acre, Laodicea, Antioch, throughout all the Levant and up to Constantinople, right? Founding banks, trading houses, everywhere pretty much, because that's what they did, even as a business, holding their own curia, right? So having their own, as we've seen, legal system locally, exercising justice on their own citizens, right? And we have info, of course, about the Amalfitans trading as far as India, right? And there is nothing strange about that, objectively. So almost everywhere in these places, the Amalfitans had privileges and exemptions, right? So these powers essentially even competed with one another inland to attract this or that maritime republic in their own havens, so that they would, have much easier access to a certain amount of goods. The Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela mentions the prosperous Alexandrian colony in the 12th century run by the Amalfitans. Right. Consider that Alexandria of Egypt had been historically, just think about the relics of Saint Mark, connected with the Venetians, right, that exported the, weapons, arms and armor, even against papal bands, pagan Slavic slaves back in the day. Well, the Amalfitans were there, even when this other republics such as Pisa, Genoa rose in power. These other ones didn't disappear. Actually, they contributed to the business of the winner, because that was the most profitable market at that point. Even a greater colony was the one of Constantinople, where the Amalfitans had a district on the Bosphorus, next to which those of the Venetians and the Pisans arose. Eloquently enough, those of all the peoples who had establishments in the Levant were modeled on the Amalfitan colony. Right? They had been the first ones doing this, so more or less the model followed by simple practice of business, whatever. But the Amalfitans can claim it this to have started it in a primal sense. The Amalfitan merchants living in these colonies naturally risked their own lives by a degree, but accumulated enormous wealth. Pantaleo is famous among them. Even the comedy of the art of the greedy, right, in Italian folklore started from, in fact, an Amalfitan, the stereotype of an Amalfitan merchant, who was an actual historical figure who obtained the imperial patriciate, right, even as an individual, interestingly enough. We're talking about the Constantinopolitan emperor, and who in fact even led the negotiations between the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire for a league against the Normans. So that's how influent, even just as, I don't know, men of law, diplomacy, of international relations, legitimately the Amalfitans were. No less than Pantaleo's son Maurus, who founded hospices in Jerusalem and in Antioch, and who also donated the famous bronze doors to the Abbey of Monte Cassino in 1071. You understand these broader connections. I mean, the Amalfitans were, again, as, say, politically and strategically tied to their own city, but for the rest, they were just freemen roaming around, donating to important monastic foundations, having whichever interest for that, and being definitely men of the world. Around the 20s of the 11th century, some merchants from Amalfi, headed by Fra Gerardo da Scala, obtained from the Caliph of Egypt the right to build a hospital dedicated to St. John and a church dedicated to St. Mary of the Latins, which, by the way, is what we think may have given birth to none less than the glorious Order of the Knights of Jerusalem, the Order of St. John, right? The Knights of St. John, Rhodes, or Malta that you want. In fact, as you have probably noticed, the Amalfitan cross is the same one used by the Knights of St. John, right? There are lots of historiographical debates regarding whether it's the same foundation. Everything is lost kind of in a bit of historical mist there. However, these mechanisms were really frequent, right? It's absolutely plausible for such a thing to have happened, in theory as much as in practice. It would be very interesting if that was the case for the Order of Malta, of the Knights of Malta. The prosperity of the Amalfitans was such that in this period the Siculo-Norman historian William of Apulia wrote that no city was richer in gold, silver, and fabrics of all sorts of Amalfi, and that Arabs, Sicilians, and Africans, and even Indians, as we've seen, met there, right? This has probably lots to do with one of the oldest codification of maritime customs, and as well as its important level of development, the Tabula Amalfitana, right? This famous document in which the Amalfitans set a bit the initial standards for, again, maritime rights. These international conventions. It began like that. We've seen them developing basically in every republic would eventually, but there were a few ones that could make it operative also for other people, right? Seemingly, it was the Amalfitans who spread the nautical compass from the Arabs among the other Western navigators, right? Some ancient and even constant tradition actually attributes the invention of the nautical compass to the same Amalfitans, right? What happened is likely that they perfected it, right? But say the inventions were much, much, much older, even much more than we think. In any case, that's what matters: how you are able to implement, to innovate, to spread. And the Amalfitans were protagonists in these technological accomplishments. Even beautiful works, of course, arose in an environment like this, as you can see there. Considered the Amalfitans were quite exposed just for their geographical position to the sumptuous sources of Constantinople and Rome, so drawing from probably the spring of classical civilization. The cathedrals of the Amalfi Coast were adorned with those rich sculptural decorations, with animals and flowers expressing through symbolic language typical of the Pelasgian Mediterranean culture of abundance, right, of nature and but that have actually much deeper, also spiritual, heavenly meaning. In fact, you have to check there the eagle, of course, appearing constantly as well. We have just fragments, right, remaining from the entire, say, magnificence you could find at the time, or the beautiful transcendence of Atrani, for example. We have cosmatesque works by clerics and rich mosaicists that can still be admired, especially in the ambo and pulpit of the Cathedral of Ravello. These are real masterpieces we've seen there, with the dragon sea monsters, the lions, and more. Also the one in the pulpit of St. John del Toro, by the way. The aforementioned patrician Pantaleo donated the beautiful bronze doors to the Cathedral of Amalfi. That is also one of the best sources for. There's a beautiful horseman, right, for properly the panoply of the, they could argue, the broader Siculo-Norman area at the time. In the 12th century, we have swords, bucklers, archers, all these things. The same was done by Pantaleo to the Church of the Holy Savior of Atrani. And another author, another donor is Barisano from Trani. So this is an Apulian who in 1179 donated for the Cathedral of Ravello. And this again tells you how also connected these various centers at that point under the Sicilian monarchy really were. Now, under the Normans, Amalfi retained the title of dukedom, interestingly enough, so to, say, maintain the a bit that older prestige, even though under Norman control, as we've seen. So much so that it was ruled by a strategos, right, the other title of, fundamentally, of Byzantine command, or military command. For example, in Ravello, right? However, even in this period, while some Amalfitan families began to emigrate to Apulia, because, as we've seen, essentially the major business was shifting gradually to those ports and those, especially land owning, right? Probably as the end of, say, these kind of republican trade liberties in favor of kind of a much more land-owning nobility or lifestyle, right? And others, however, who had saved or made their wealth with trade still, adorned the Amalfitan churches, palaces, and villas with a new flowering of art. You have numerous Sicilian craftsmen, whose name we do not really know, unfortunately, who gave the region during the 12th and 13th century that beautiful and graceful, what we call properly Arab Sicilian decorative splendor. But mostly we attribute this to the Arabs because at some point we decided that everything Western was bad and evil and impositive and imperialistic and all this BS. But actually, these were Sicilian craftsmen, surely influenced, there's no doubt about, Arab style, whatever. There's also something flowing from previous art for that matter. But being able to replicate it pretty much everywhere in the lands of the Sicilian crown, including the Amalfi coast. The same bell tower of the Amalfi Cathedral that you have seen here in the pictures with the decoration of intertwined arches and ceramics is one of the best examples of that. For example, the magnificent ornaments in black tuff, marble, and bricks of the Ruffolo Villa in Ravello are amazing. You realize that they basically incorporated this whole monument within a villa entirely. Right? This gives you a scale of the wealth of these single families. The clusters with large intertwined ogives of the Paradise and of the Capucin friars in Amalfi, right? That remains still by without like the upper part, etc. But the architectural structure of many of these churches naturally owes much to the Sicilian types that were flowering at that point under the Oathville, and reflect this type of art which during the Norman domination was magnificently established in the region. Now, how did Amalfi play in the later centuries of the Middle Ages? Because we have seen that they lost substantial independence, right? And even part of their autonomy, of course. But the Sicilian kingdom had a lot of troubled times, especially during the 13th century. Well, during the invasion of Otto IV of Brunswick, and we talked a lot about that passage, the minority of Frederick II, the protection of Innocent III. We are at the time of Bouvines, of Philip II of France, of John of England, etc. The Amalfi coast was occupied by the German forces, right? The emperor Otto had promised the Pope not to reunite. The entire thing was like the Pope was saying, don't reunite Sicily and Germany, don't reunite Sicily and Germany, don't reunite Sicily and Germany. And Otto IV said, yeah, okay, I will not. And then the first thing he did was reuniting Sicily and Germany. Naturally, he attempted in a way, because he didn't enjoy an overwhelming support even in Germany. But the thing was pretty serious, and at a point, the Germans were around already since the time of Henry VI. The minority of Frederick II, and some of them had basically turned into some kind of local lords, exploiting the lack of a strong monarch at that point in the south. So Amalfi was simply occupied as one of these so important strongholds. Later on, you know how the thing followed, at least with Frederick II, who made so many videos about that. Nothing really particular occurred here, because we do not have all the time in the world to digress. However, when later on Pope Alexander IV became master of the Sicilian kingdom, because the last, at least mature heir again of the adult heir of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, Conrad IV, had died, and so his son was still a child. He enfeoffed the Duchy of Amalfi for the first time to Berchtold, Otto, and Ludwig of Hohenburg we are in 1255. This occurred because, again, the situation is complicated. It was Manfred of Sicily, and then this other guys acting on behalf of the Pope, more or less, in a successory crisis. And everything actually about that enfeoffment didn't even technically take place. Manfred, the natural son of, and heir at that point, Frederick, at least heir, at least in the territorial continuity of Frederick II in Sicily, on the other hand, established a colony of Saracens in Atrani. These guys had been literally deported by Frederick II from Sicily. Like, we call them Saracens, but they were just basically a bunch of Sicilian martyrs. Their leader was disemboweled in front of them by Frederick II's spoor. This tells you a bit like the profile of the ruler, and they were famously enough established in the colony of Lucera in this strategic location in northern Apulia. But Manfred used some of these guys that were loyal to him in this settlement, as we've seen, basically at the outskirts of Amalfi. Charles of Anjou came with a papal crusade, and he crushed first Tancred at Benevent, and then the young Conradin, the son of Conrad IV, at Tagliacozzo 2 years later, or in 1268. So that the new Angevin king granted the Duchy of Amalfi to Allard de Valéry, that is to say, the winner of the day, the old Templar that had advised Charles to carry out a concealed maneuver by hiding a reserve, actually with the king, and who was with another guy in disguise acting like him in open field and actually crushing the German, Italian, and Spanish army that had basically won the day and recovered the kingdom of Sicily from the Angevins. So Amalfi was the prize for the guy who had come up with this. Technically, however, also this enfeoffment had no effect, really, for different reasons that we don't have time to digress on. But governing the kingdom of Sicily at this point is becoming really a freaking mess, to say the least, because it was, first of all, huge. Secondly, the barons had taken over during this crisis an enormous amount of things, so whoever came to rule in southern Italy afterward had to negotiate with this kind of proto-mafia, basically, as the local noblemen that were involved in this kind of massive estates that the kings could not quite simply wipe out. So as we've seen, the main blow suffered by the Amalfitans had been 1135 with the destruction, the ferocious sack of the Pisans, at least the destruction of surrounding settlements, and the gradual diminishment of the Amalfitan, of the power of the Amalfitan eastern colonies, right, while the Venetians, the Genoese, and the Pisan ones basically took their place in the market, also violently at some point. So there was, for example, some Amalfitan stronghold resisting in Acre, which died out only the mid-13th century before the fall, about which I made a video about the entire siege of Acre. The Amalfitan presence in the Levantine ports continued for some times up to essentially the peak of the great medieval civilization, temporarily the first half of the 14th century at that point, under the reign of Robert of Anjou, Robert the Wise, king of Naples. So there was still naturally a trade, communication with Barbary, Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean Sea, Constantinople. There was also a Catalonian presence now, as we've seen recently. Made a video about medieval Catalonia, the ports rising in relevance and visiting the same Amalfi, right? There was a terrible storm, right? A great wave that hit Amalfi on November the 24th, 1343. The water smashed the ports, the arsenals, the moorings, right, along with a large part of Amalfi herself, and together with other settlements of the coast. So the entire province lost further power because damage was severe. These were the very years just before the plague, pretty dark times, telling the truth. And Amalfi simply followed the rest, say, Neapolitan history in a way. There was the war between the Durazzos and the Angevins. Amalfi sided with the first. As a consequence, by the way, the Provençals of Louis II of Anjou sacked the city, together with the Rabello and Scala in 1392. So further damage. The dukedom of Amalfi was enfeoffed at that point by Ladislas to Wenceslas Sanseverino, who was the Duke of Venosa. It was, again, one of the powerful Apulian nobility in 1398. He was actually killed later, right, sentenced to death for rebellion, so that the Amalfitan duchy passed to Girolamo Colonna in 1405, and then to Raimondo Orsini. So we see these powerful, in this case, Roman houses that also had branches in southern Italy, mostly as condottieri at that point. The invasion of Jean of Anjou was also a thing. Amalfi at that point gave herself up to the invader. We're in 1459 again. There is no resistance. You understand that, again, this is not much of a power anymore. There were other great polities within the Sicilian kingdom. It was huge. I don't know, the Principality of Taranto, the Duchy of Calabria, these kind of things were semi-autonomous, but Amalfi was just, again, this tiny thing extensionally, and at sea that had been her traditional source of power. Again, she had been ousted, so again, it's just like you're talking about the history of a town whatsoever now. Well, it was still important, arguably, for, say, medieval European standards, but, I mean, that's not exaggerated. At this point, there are massive cities also around. Naples is huge, and beyond. So after this war, King Ferdinand I of Aragon rewarded Ferdinand Piccolomini, that was the nephew of Pope Pius II, by the way, for the service rendered to him with, first of all, his daughter, Mary, his natural daughter, actually, because dynastically speaking, that was a bit the practice. You give that to a condottiere that serves you then. For the rest, you maintain a more of an international royalty connection. The Piccolomini was, in fact, enfeoffed with the Duchy of Amalfi in 1461. And in fact, the Piccolomini would maintain such possession for 5 generations. The last duke died in 1582, Giovanni. His widow basically sold the Amalfitan duchy, right? That made 216,000 ducats, which tells you that it's a freaking lot, right? But it tells you, however, how, by the way, much more expensive other possessions really were. And so this was just to cash a little for these kind of families now. But we are in the modern age, so we do not really go further than that. So the Amalfitans, as you understand, have quite a place in the history of European maritime accomplishments. Their families of rich merchants, as we've seen, were all one with the political body in the days of glory, and they would remain as, especially the oldest families, where you can see even certain surnames bearing trace of the older magistracies. For example, Comite, right, from Comites, that is the count. Those were the guys who held, in fact, the title of count during the Republic in the 9th century. And there were many others that are a bit, so similar. Like one was Capuano, from Capua, evidently. Brancia, Orefice, which means goldsmith. Could have been a craft, at least at the head of a guild of craftsmen, things like that. Del Giudice, so of the judge, yet another magistracy. Del Liguori, at least among the most important. There were also some Amalfitans who had, as we've seen, made their fortune, at least in the Neapolitan administration, politics. There were some scholars coming from there. A certain Vito Pisanello was secretary of Frederick of Aragon. Giovanello de Cuncto was secretary for the same, and many other names, but I guess this would be a bit just too anecdotal to remember. In any case, so I'm glad at least to have completed, after years, after all, just mostly the 4 major videos, at least on to the most important Italian maritime republics. We'll have to talk about others, because they weren't just the only ones. There were, I don't know, Ancona or Bari or Gaeta or others, as we mentioned them. I mean, Naples or Sorrento in the same Campanian area were there. I recently made a video about the Republic of Ragusa / Dubrovnik in Dalmatia. And I think it's always a fascinating story, because it shows how just an extensionally tiny power could be literally could control, in virtue of this permanent naval forces, the actual political and strategic balance of the Mediterranean. This is maybe not the utmost case of Amalfi. Venice would be de facto the only one of these powers to actually at least become a real superpower. Like Genoa too was pretty close to that, but the idea is that Amalfi also emerged in a time in which other republics were emerging. Was in fact the first one to rise, also the first one to fade as a consequence. But the primacy is fascinating, and it's fascinating again also because it shows how the earlier, in the Middle Ages, the more advanced southern Italy was, especially as far as the urban potential was, really. Then the feudal monarchy basically kind of cut the possibility of the southern southern cities to basically have an independent policy on their own. So things really changed a lot, right? By the end of this period, as I was saying before, the southern cities were even large by European standards, were great agricultural markets, but they didn't have much of a political power. They were just ruled by the noblemen of the hinterland, right? As we've seen in other Italian city-states history, that things in the center and in the north went very differently, right? So it's also this Byzantine background that is fascinating in of itself, and we will keep looking at Amalfitan history, surely at some other point, hopefully, I would say, as always, in other videos. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.